war. If we want to talk about constitutional ignorance, you're going to get a lot of it really fast when you talk about war, conflict, and war powers under the Constitution. So today I want to talk about what I see as some of the top, I guess, lies or pieces of propaganda about what's going on in the Middle East. We're going to talk about things about whether it's defensive, the authorization to use military force, the AUMF, who's on our side, who's being right about the Constitution, and on and on. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Boldin. I am your Happy Southern Poverty Law Center designated hate watch monger leader of the radical right over here at the 10th Amendment Center, where we broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. We have a lot of live channels that we do through video, such as Facebook, YouTube, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope. We have archived video versions at Brighteon.com, BitChute.com, and BitTubers.com. Plus, we have an audio-only podcast edition that we do through iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and elsewhere. I think we're also on Podbean, and I think we are trying to get on iHeartRadio. Anyways, you can find all of those platforms, all the ways to follow our organization, 10th Amendment Center, like getting our newsletter, email newsletter, our social media platforms. You can find all of the archives to the show, links that I reference in each episode, and even ways to support us like through our membership program, which is as little as $2 a month. Get all of that information over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, before getting into all the details, I do want to say hi to some of the friends out in the live chat. I appreciate you all joining me, whether you're here live or in the archive. Andrew Nappy, Dan Warsaw, Arizonan Eagle, Yo Mama, Luke Porras, Denver Libertarian, Essential Freedom, Shane Lackey, Kentucky Liberty, Justin Morrison, Dan Reed, and anybody that I'm missing. I apologize if I've missed you, Tabor, and others. And again, all the platforms you may be watching or listening on, they're very easily triggered. So a simple comment, a like, smashing the like button, sharing, all that stuff triggers the algorithm and tells the platform to show the program to more people. Or if you listen to the podcast version, reviews are absolutely amazing, and I'm grateful for all of those who have been leaving those reviews. And I want to say hi to Clay Davis over on Facebook as well. So anyways, let's get into this today. First of all, I think we need to start out with a foundational principle. And I often talk about how Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention famously said, and maybe not famously enough because so few people actually follow this advice, but he said, show me an age and a country, and this is me paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but Patrick Henry basically said, show me an age and a country where people trusted their rulers to be good people without a subsequent loss of liberty. In other words, as soon as you trust government officials to do the right thing, you've already lost because you shouldn't be trusting them at all. But it wasn't just Patrick Henry. Many other founders gave us the same kind of warning, and I want to start off today with a good one from John Adams, and he says this: trust no man living with power to endanger the public liberty. So we should trust no one who has the power to endanger public liberty. And if we recognize that what James Madison said was most likely correct, he said war is the most dreaded threat to public liberty because wars give you armies, and armies leads to debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments. James Madison said, not me. He said, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So we can go across the political spectrum from the founders and find warnings against trusting people, and then warnings against trusting people with war powers as well. So that's where I really like to start. So then let's go through some of what I think are just lies about what's going on, falsehoods, misunderstandings, whatever we want to call it. I'll call it propaganda garbage if you'd like, because that's really how I feel about it. So let's get to it. The first one, I think, is that it was a defensive action that just happened. Now, let's say that this guy, Soleimani, who I can guarantee almost no American even knew this guy's name before a couple of days ago. And now suddenly everyone's an expert on him. And maybe he's a bad guy, maybe he's not. But I also didn't know his name until a few days ago. Or maybe it just rung a bell from something earlier. But most of us had no idea who this guy was until the other day. So we're told by the U.S. government that he was there planning an immediate attack, and that this was defensive and stopping an attack. But other people are telling us something different, and I think this is what should cause us to at least question. First of all, we should trust no one with the power of war. If we're honoring the advice of Patrick Henry, John Adams, James Madison, and so many others, we shouldn't trust what we hear and just believe that, oh, automatically, if they're saying this, it's correct. They're not going to just use this to expand their power or do things that they've been pushing to do for decades. We shouldn't trust that just automatically. And I think a lot of people reflexively are just repeating that they're trusting this. I mean, they're not even saying the word trust, but they're blindly following what the government people are telling us through their media mouthpieces when we're told that the media is the enemy of the people, which I agree. But here we are in Axios. And if you watch the Ron Paul Liberty Report live with Daniel McAdams and Ron Paul just, I guess, about a half hour ago, they talked about this in a little bit more detail. I urge you to actually go check out that episode after this if you'd like. Not during it, of course. But the Prime Minister of Iraq specifically has told the world that this guy Soleimani was actually there to meet with the Prime Minister of Iraq on a peace mission. Like, okay, maybe they're all warmongers, maybe they're all politicians, maybe they're all liars, but here over in Axios, Mahdi, that's the PM, he revealed that Soleimani was in Baghdad at the time of his killing to meet with him and relay Iran's response to a Saudi request for dialogue. I mean, we can call that peace mission. I think that's what McAdams called it on Ron Paul's show. And even if we want to call it just negotiations, that's fine. There is an active negotiation that the PM of Iraq is working with between the Saudis and the Iranians. And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the war that the U.S. is supporting between Saudi Arabia and Yemen as well, and a proxy war that's been going on for so long against Iran. So let's say that they're all liars. Let's say that all these politicians are liars, that Trump is lying, that Pompeo is lying, that Mahdi is lying, that everybody is lying. Well, we don't need to know that they're telling the truth or not. We just need to know that we shouldn't trust them. And of course, and this is an article that I sent out as an email campaign just a couple of days ago, limited airstrikes qualify as war. I urge you to read that. I will put a link in the show notes if you haven't checked it out over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And here's a quick excerpt. As James Madison pointed out, a constitutional argument is, quote, triable by its consequences. Here, the consequences would certainly be unlimited executive war power, since almost any significant activity can be linked to national security or a need to defend American interests, because it is incontrovertible that the unlimited executive war power is not what the Founders' Constitution granted. The argument fails. And a little bit more, I think, is interesting. The argument is also a scary one because historically we've heard national security often used as an excuse for the suspension of individual rights. We hear about that when it comes to your right to privacy with mass surveillance, with gun control, against your right to keep and bear arms. We've heard it was an emergency, that millions were going to die in the streets if Obamacare wasn't supported. We are always going to hear these types of arguments. I also tweeted this the other day, and I think it makes a lot of sense as well. And I apologize if it's not showing up well on the screen, but basically I said, if you put your military in 150 plus countries, and I know some people laugh at that there's not bases at 150 countries, but there's some type of a presence. Sometimes they're called lily pads, sometimes they're called other things. But if you put your military in 150 plus countries, eventually someone is going to be pissed about it. And right or wrong, they're going to do something in response. But to then cry we're acting in defense is not just utter bullshit, but much worse. So I think the idea of talking about this as defensive is nonsense. On the Ron Paul Liberty Report, they showed a map similar to this. It is a little outdated from my research, but it's pretty close. If you're watching the screen here, you can see a picture of the Middle East, kind of just a drawing. And this comes from an article by David Stockman over on LouRockwell.com this morning. And it's a picture of Iran with tons of U.S. flags surrounding it. Turkey, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, all these places, all the stands with all these American flags that show a military presence surrounding Iran. You don't have anything like that in Mexico or Canada or in Cuba, for example, surrounding the U.S. So the idea that Iran is an aggressor here sounds pretty absurd to me. And the fact that you're in a place that you shouldn't be in the first place, the troops should not be there in the first place, and then to say we're just acting in self-defense means it is an argument for perpetual warfare, no matter what. I also want to point out, number two, and maybe there was more than just one there, is that the AUMF, a lot of people are making a legal argument that the authorization to use military force, there's actually two of them. 2001 was a very broad one against anybody that might be assisting Al-Qaeda, whatever. And there's another one in 2002 that was more narrowly tailored for Iraq. Now, anyone who thinks that this is kind of a new thing coming up is just ignorant of all history. And even if we ignore all the long, deep history back to the 1950s, the CIA involved in a coup against Iran and supporting a brutal dictator for decades, which led to the revolution in '79 and problem and back and forth and fighting and killing on both sides for so many decades. Even if we ignore all that, we know for a fact it was so much pushing for this, some kind of action, military action against Iran since early 2019 and before that, just at least in current times. There's so much of it that I did a full episode on this on February 27th, 2019, talking about how the neocons and their supporters were wanting to get into a military conflict in Iran or Iraq. I mean, and they're claiming that this is their authority to do it. So I believe that they've been laying the groundwork under the Trump administration for quite some time. Again, I will link to that in the show notes. But let's look at the AUMF. That a lot of people will say, well, they declared war. Well, this is nonsense. They haven't declared war since summer of 1942 against, I believe it was Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. It was June of 1942. This was just kind of this was an official declaration. I don't think they actually needed to even do that one because everyone was engaged in war. And we know a declaration of war isn't necessarily just a drafting of a piece of paper, but they did make it official. The previous one to that was Germany and Japan. There hasn't been an official constitution declaration of war since the 1940s. So some people want you to believe that the AUMF is a declaration of war. And I covered this in more detail in that episode last year. So if you really want to understand that, if you care to understand about that, I don't think a lot of people do. I think people just want to hold to their own views and they don't care about facts. But that's fine. If you want to learn about it, I will link to that in the show notes. You can Google it as well. Iran, AUMF, war and the Constitution. You'll find it. Pretty easy. Google has that information. But here's a quote from the AUMF of 2001. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts or international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. It sounds like Congress is saying, President, you're authorized to do this. And yes, Congress is saying that, but Congress isn't actually declaring war against anybody. And they don't have to have the words declare war in there. They could call it the Easter Bunny resolution if they wanted to, but they are not actually stating that there is a status of war vis-a-vis any specific organization, any specific state, any specific country, any specific anything. They're literally passing the buck and saying the president gets to determine who we're going to be in conflict with, in a state of war with. And there is nothing in the Constitution that authorizes one branch to redelegate a delegated power to another branch. The executive branch is not authorized to say, well, I really like Nancy Pelosi now. I'm just thinking of the most absurd thing. Let's say Donald Trump fell in love with Nancy Pelosi. I think many of his policies, in essence, when it comes to treating the Constitution, are basically the same as Nancy's. They're garbage. But let's say he decided to publicly proclaim his love for sweet Nancy and say, Nancy, you are now the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and you get to make this decision. No, no, no. The Constitution doesn't authorize them to do that. The power to declare war, that is, to decide whether or not there was going to be peace or war, is with Congress. And here, Congress is specifically saying the president can determine. The president can determine. No, Congress is the one that's supposed to determine that. I'll just do that very briefly. And basically, this is the same thing that happened in the 2002 AUMF that was supposedly a declaration of war against Iraq. They're just saying you can, but the president is authorized, it says, to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate. They're just saying as long as the president determines it's necessary. The president may determine that it's not necessary. But James Madison and so many others told us that Congress alone makes that decision. And then once Congress says we're at war with Iraq or we're going to use force against Iraq, whatever they're going to say, whatever words they're going to use, the president is supposed to do it. The president doesn't have a choice to not do it. If he does, well, I mean, he does. If he believes in his own faith that that would be a violation of the Constitution, would be morally wrong, he would refuse to do it and set himself up for impeachment. And then that's how the whole conflict is supposed to play out between the branches. Congress is supposed to assert itself. The president is supposed to assert himself as well. And I think the same could go if the Congress or the legislature refuses to declare war after the president asks for it. The president should make a case that this is a dangerous situation. If this is what he believes, we know they've been planning this for a long time. At very least, we know under the current administration, they've been planning this since early 2019, and they certainly had time over the last year to say, this is a dangerous situation. We need to, this is a situation where we have to have a declaration of war, or after the downing of a drone, whatever it may be. They had time, and we keep getting told that there's no time for Congress to do something. Let's say Congress refuses, and then the president decides to do something anyways. Then he makes the claim, then he has to make the case to the general public that he was acting on behalf of the country in self-defense and show us that. Not just that we just trust him. So many people just trust government. When we're hearing opposite things from different government officials, you shouldn't trust any of these people, especially when we're talking about so many decades and decades and decades of an expansive central government. A central government, the largest government in the history of the world, the largest military empire in the history of the world, 23 trillion and rising in debt, surveillance on everybody, gun control all over the place. I mean, we're supposed to trust these people? I wouldn't trust these people with anything that they say, and anyone who does is a complete fool in my book. It's not trust but verify. It's verify and nothing else. I still wouldn't trust it when they do the right thing, because a broken clock gets things right once or twice a day. Let's say once these days. So here's some information from fcnl.org. The 2001 AUMF have been used by 3 different presidents to justify 41 operations in 19 countries. Congress never declared war on any of those countries. They told the president that the president could decide. So there are now 19, or there have been 19 unconstitutional wars that the president made the decision on, that the president, 3 different presidents, Bush, Obama, and, of course, Donald Trump. And the previous presidents did the same thing, too. So I don't want anyone to think that this is it is anti-Trump, it's anti-Obama, it's anti-Bush, it's anti-Clinton, it's pro-Constitution. Anybody who violates the Constitution is the bad guy. It is the president's duty to follow their oath, even when Congress abdicates its role. Follow the oath to the Constitution. That is their only job, period. So they've used this AUMF from 2001 to justify wars in 19 countries. 19. The Obama administration, no good guys there either. Awful peace president, fake peace president. The administration later cited the 2002 AUMF as an alternative statutory basis to the 2001. So they're saying, well, we want to use the 2001 AUMF, but if that one ends up getting repealed, or if we can't make a legal justification, we've got another thing here. And so that just shows that the Obama administration is complete garbage on this as well. And I think we'll cover that a little bit more in a little bit. And his administration said they basically had a backup plan in case they couldn't get authorization for its campaign against ISIS in Iraq, while maintaining that our, quote, position on the 2002 AUMF hasn't changed and we'd like to see it repealed. They're saying they wanted to get rid of it, but they still had the alternative backup plan where they could continue doing whatever. So it's all just legalese garbage. The Trump administration, they report, reiterated this position, claiming in 2018 that the 2002 AUMF reinforces the authority to use force against ISIS in Iraq, but it also went further, asserting that the 2002 AUMF authorizes force to address both threats to or stemming from Iraq, in Syria, or elsewhere. So what happens when Congress is weak and Congress passes the buck and Congress doesn't take responsibility like they're supposed to do? Then executive branches, the president, no matter what team is in charge, they just continue finding new legal justifications in the same thing to do more and more stuff. We shouldn't be surprised at this. John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, warned us about this, among many other founders. This is just one of my favorite quotes. He said, "All artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible." This is a truism throughout history. If Dickinson was writing about this in the mid-18th century, and we still aren't aware of it today, this is on us. We need to know. We need to look at with a cautious and jealous eye on anyone who approaches that precious jewel of liberty, that approaches that precious jewel of delegated power. This is a serious trust. You don't ever hear people saying, you know, we really need to do this, but it's unconstitutional. No, every government action is described to us as constitutional all through history. I mean, if we're going all the way back to the New Deal and before to the Lincoln time, before that as well, Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, politicians will always claim that what they're doing is not only just but right, but legal. And we're going to hear more and more twisted arguments as to why it's legal. But again, we shouldn't trust them. John Dickinson warned us as well. So another thing that we're told is that Iraq actually wants us there. And I don't think any of us really understand Iraqi society, this kind of weird, severed, Shia, Sunni, Kurdish, all these different regions. None of us can understand that. None of us can speak on their behalf. We don't know. I sure don't know. I know you don't know. So we shouldn't actually make these types of claims. Pompeo keeps telling us this, but Pompeo's a piece of garbage and he shouldn't be trusted. Now, maybe he's right, but that doesn't mean we should trust him. On the other hand, here's what the Iraqi Prime Minister said. Official tweet from the official Government of Iraq Twitter account. Quote, "Carrying out operations to assassinate Iraqi figures and figures from another country on Iraqi soil is a flagrant violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a dangerous escalation. I would make the case that this is an act of war against Iraq. Even if you were to say it's only self-defense against Iran, let's throw that out there. It was self-defense against Iran. This is not an act of war against Iran. I disagree with that, but it's still an act of war against Iraq because Iraq is saying you did not have permission to do this. You aren't allowed to do this. And if we understand what the founders understood to be a definition of war, we can go back to founding era dictionaries. Here, this is what Rob Nadelson, a top constitutional scholar, he said, founding era dictionaries and other sources, both legal and lay, tell us that when the Constitution was approved, war consisted of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. A very typical dictionary definition, and this is, he's actually citing one of the most popular law dictionaries. They were legal experts. These weren't just people who are just using words. The words were very specifically crafted when they drafted that Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention. They knew what they were talking about, the words, what they meant in law. The Barlow Dictionary of 1772 to 73 was very popular with the founders, and this is how war was described: the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. So an act of war is when violence is used by a sovereign, the United States, against another that's in opposition to it. And if this doesn't sound like this tweet, this statement from the Prime Minister and the government of Iraq is not saying that they oppose this, I think you're just lying to yourself. So they clearly oppose this. They even go further, because a lot of people say, oh, we're welcome there, this is part of agreement. But the Iraqi government doesn't agree that they can just do this, especially when the Iraqi government is saying they're trying to broker a deal to stop the violence. They're having a lot of problems there. So the Iraqi PM says the assassinations violate the conditions governing the presence of U.S. forces in Iraq, whose role is to train Iraqi forces and assist in the fight against Daesh as part of the global coalition, subject to the supervision and approval of the Iraqi government. Again, maybe they're lying, and maybe the U.S. government is lying, but the fact of the matter is we shouldn't trust these people, and we shouldn't necessarily just trust what people are saying when we hear them say, oh, this is what can be done. We can do whatever we want whenever. Now, on top of it, and I know this was a very partisan vote. A lot of people probably have heard about this. There was a vote in the Iraqi parliament to expel, to call, not to expel. This is a non-binding resolution. If you've been watching my shows recently, you know that non-binding resolutions are non-binding resolutions. They are not, I know some people are reporting on it improperly. They're saying Iraq votes to expel. No, the Iraqi parliament, a very partisan group, voted. It wasn't even all of them present, but there was a majority or whatever is needed to actually have an official resolution. The prime minister called for this and said, we need to vote to kick these people out. Now, the way it works, and I'm no expert on Iraqi government structure that was set up by the U.S. Invasion. And mind you, this guy, Mahdi, he was part of the Iraq provisional government that was set up in the wake of the destruction of Iraq by the U.S. military. And mind you, the destruction of Iraq wasn't just that war in 2003 or so. It wasn't just the one in 1991. It was also the Iraq-Iran war, where the U.S. government funded billions of dollars worth of equipment and training and weapons to Saddam Hussein to fight against Iran. Millions of people were killed. So this whole area certainly is going to be filled with animosity. Let's say all the propagandists for this stuff are absolutely correct, and the U.S. is just on a mission of peace and saving people. Do you think the people who grew up in Iran, I met a girl years ago who was dating a friend of mine, and she talked about how she was 14 years old, 12 to 14 years old in those times in the early 80s. I guess she's about my age because I was born in 72. So she was wake up in the morning and try to go to school, and she would wake up and walk out, and she would smell burning flesh in her neighborhood because there was so much killing all the time. And she was just in a major, I think she was in Tehran. I'm not sure what city she was in. But these are the type of thing that people grow up with. And do you think that the people living in those areas are going to just be loving and welcoming people with open arms, dancing in the streets like we heard Cheney and Rumsfeld and now Pompeo and others claiming? This is, I mean, it's certainly understandable that people are going to be pissed off at the United States for always being around and being around when there's a lot of death and destruction. And even if they're wrong, we can understand they're going to be pretty upset. So the fact of the matter is the government of Iraq is telling the world this is not welcome. This is a violation of our sovereignty. A violation of sovereignty is really an act of war when it comes with violence as well. So, and I would even say that sanctions are an act of war. Ron Paul says the same thing. And even at a time years ago, I forget the exact details off the top of my head, but during the founding era, there was a situation where merely withdrawing from a treaty was considered an act of war because of what would result from it. Now, not every time, but they were not kidding about this kind of stuff. So the Iraq parliament, approved a 5-point action plan. And the way in general that it works, according to my understanding, they approve this non-binding resolution that says this is what the representatives of the people want to do. And we want the Iraqi government, which is separate from the parliament, to take these steps. Now, the prime minister, at least the acting prime minister, Mahdi, who's been around he was vice president under the U.S., I guess we could call it installed coalition or transitional government after they totally toppled that regime there. But this guy Mahdi, who's now the current prime minister and has stepped down but is basically a caretaker PM, he's saying, look, we want him out. We don't want him here. Let's get him out. And so they said, like, here's the process. We want you out. We want to get rid of not just the U.S., but all foreign governments, foreign militaries. That includes Iran. They don't even want Iran there. And these are supposedly the Iran-backed parts of the government. I also read a report where one of the leaders of the Kurdish side who was actually saying, no, we don't support this. We want the U.S. troops to stay. At the same time, they're saying, well, even though the U.S. violated our agreement. So even the people who want the U.S. to stay, they're saying that the agreement has been violated as well. Now, this morning, actually, I think it came out last night. A lot of people, again, still think that the U.S. is there on invitation and that I think it was like 2014 is the most recent one. But this doesn't sound like an invitation to me, and I'm assuming this type of thing happens behind the scenes, not just in Iraq, but in places around the world. The U.S. pushes itself around on people. It bribes, it threatens, it warns all the time. And I think what Donald Trump is doing a favor to us is that he's actually doing, I mean, it's terrible what he's doing, but he's actually making it very obvious and very public that the U.S. government doesn't care what other people want. They're just going to threaten and do what the U.S. government wants to do anyways. And here's what he said to reporters on Air Force One. Quote, this was in response to the non-binding vote from Parliament calling on the Iraqi government to take steps. He said, if they do ask us to leave, if we don't do it in a very friendly basis, we will charge them sanctions like they've never seen before ever. Now, keep in mind that the warmonger pigs, Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, and others, they put sanctions on Iraq for a long time throughout the 90s. And Albright was famously asked on some kind of whatever TV talk program that is just pointless these days. But she was asked, you know, there's reports that say 700,000 people were killed, as many as 300,000 or more children were killed due to these sanctions. What do you feel about that? And she paused and she said, well, we think it's worth it. So even if those numbers are incorrect, the mindset of these people is that just to contain Saddam Hussein, after funding Saddam Hussein to kill Iranians, to then overthrow Saddam Hussein and have the death of hundreds of thousands of people is okay. So they're terrible, terrible people. And Trump is saying we're going to have even worse sanctions than they've ever had. And they've already gone through this. A lot of people who are still alive understand the death and suffering that happened throughout Iraq, getting starved to death through the Clinton sanctions. He says, we have a very extraordinarily expensive air base that's there. It cost billions of dollars to build, long before my time. We're not leaving unless they pay us back for it. That does not sound like someone who wants to de-escalate. That does not sound like someone who wants to follow the Constitution, that wants to respect other people. This sounds like a mafia thug. We're doing what we're doing unless you pay us off. This is totally evil in my book. So one other thing that I think is totally false is that supposedly Congress is going to fight over war powers. The Democrats. Let's get to the Democrats because they're horrible too. This is from The Hill. Congress to clash over Trump's war powers. I'm sorry that The Hill has terrible formatting. This is from someone called Alexander Bolton. I wonder if there's a relation to good old John Warmonger Pig Bolton as well. It's not the same name as mine. But they say, Democrats will attempt to curb President Trump's war powers after a U.S. drone strike killed a senior Iranian military leader in what lawmakers are calling a major escalation that could lead to war. Now, it could lead to an all-out total conflict, but it is an act of war because an act of violence by a sovereign over opposition, which is exactly what's happening in Iraq, absolutely happened. So according to the founder's definition of what makes an act of war, there is absolutely an act of war against the country of Iraq. even if you disagree that it was against Iran and that you can't claim self-defense after surrounding a country with military bases for decades. So Senate Democrats, the Hill goes on, are mobilizing behind a resolution that would force Trump to withdraw American troops from hostilities against Iran unless Congress declares war or passes a resolution authorizing military force. Trump isn't going to follow this. Obama wouldn't follow it. Bush wouldn't follow it. Clinton wouldn't follow it. No one in the future would follow it because none of these people can be trusted. Why would they follow it when they know that the opposition party, these same people who are passing these resolutions, aren't going to have the same kind of resolution? Democrats weren't pushing this kind of resolution against Obama, while Republicans wanted to see this kind of thing against Obama. All they really care about when it comes to the Constitution, and I'll get to that in a moment, is the fact that they're opposing the party in power. I don't trust these Democrats. They are terrible when it comes to the Constitution and war powers. Mind you, just a few weeks ago, Democrats in the House overwhelmingly gave $700 to $800 billion of National Defense Authorization Act funding for 2020 to the executive branch. They also included something, I believe they included something in there, or they tried to stop action against Iran and against Yemen, and both were removed. If that's the case, and I may be incorrect on the Iran part, but if they removed it, they've also killed their own argument that somehow now they're okay with it. Because one could look at the legislative history and say, well, they tried to include this and they rejected it, so therefore they really don't mean it. So I think we have a very problematic opposition. People should not trust the Democrats now, just like I would say people shouldn't trust the Republicans now or before. People shouldn't trust any politician. Again, as John Adams put it, trust no man, no person, if we want to be more modern about it. No human being, no anyone living with power to endanger the public liberty. And this is also an interesting report. Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, this comes from the Daily Wire, Barack Obama launched more than 2,800 strikes on Iraq and Syria without congressional approval. Thank you, peace Democrats. Thank you, resistance, for giving them this argument that you look like partisan hacks. And now when you talk about needing a declaration of war, supporters of the administration are like, well, you're just Nancy Pelosi now. Thanks a lot, Democrats, for ruining it. And thanks a lot, Republicans, for ruining it before that. So they're all evil. And I think the last thing to point out, the last major falsehood, is that none of these people, none of them, Democrat, Republican, none of them are actual Constitution supporters. Look, even if they get it right from time to time, they usually only get it right when the opposing party is in power, and they never seem to get it right when their own team is in power. They're happy to go along with expansions of government power, especially when it comes to war powers when their political party is running the government. And then they all of a sudden act like Constitution supporters. They want to follow what the founders had to say when the other team is doing it. If this was Hillary Clinton here, you would not have Democrats telling us this. I would, instead of hearing that I'm a commie, which I've been hearing for quite some time now, anytime I just bring up the Constitution, I point out the founders, I'm getting called horrible. It just tells me I'm over the target. I get called all kinds of evil things. I hate this country. I'm with the terrorists. Look, I heard this garbage back in 2006. When I started the organization, every time I opposed an unconstitutional act of the Bush administration, it's the same robotic, mindless trash that is an embarrassment for this country. We heard the same robotic, mindless garbage when I opposed Obamacare, when the 10th Amendment Center worked to nullify it. Rachel Maddow took a 14-minute segment to talk about how we're neo-Confederate racists. We want to see the Union split up into the whites controlling the blacks. I mean, however she put it. But basically, she suggested we were racists that wanted to bring back the Confederacy in order to support slavery because we were opposed to Obamacare and wanted to nullify it, wanted to nullify gun control and so many other federal programs that shouldn't exist. But we hear this kind of garbage all the time. And at the same time, we also hear, and I did an article, I should have linked this, right after the Trump administration took office. all of a sudden you started hearing some interesting and actually very good constitutional arguments from Democrats. But this is what they do. I don't think these politicians are actually stupid. A lot of people tell me when we point out something about the Constitution that we should supposedly make sure you teach your representative in Congress. It looks like they've never read it. I actually don't buy that. I think a lot of these people are evil manipulators, and they actually know the right arguments. They just keep their mouth shut, and they don't care about them. They only care when they can use it as a bludgeoning tool against their political opponents. And of course, a lot of people, even if they agree with the fact that these types of things are unconstitutional, a lot of times we're hearing from people, look, we just got to do this one time only. Now, if you're a regular viewer of the show or a listener of the show, you know that one time only. We can go back to John Dickinson writing in response to the Townsend Acts, the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. He talked about the Spanish Parliament giving up something that they never should have given up. That is the ability of the king to raise money for war without approval of their parliament. They allowed it in one time for an emergency. I think it was against the Moors. One time in an emergency. And Dickinson reminded us that it was at that moment, as soon as they said, for this emergency only, you can do this, it was at that moment that the people of Spain ceased to be free. Because as soon as you give them a precedent to do it in an emergency, someone is going to use more and more examples. Artful rulers are going to come up with interesting legal arguments as to how everything they do is going to be legal and constitutional. And of course, George Washington very famously warned us against things like this. So if you don't like the fact that the Constitution delegates to one branch and the other the power to declare war, and the executive branch can't do this type of stuff, and that the troops shouldn't have been there because there was no real declaration of war in the first place, and it's all unconstitutional. And the only thing they should be doing is following the Constitution, bringing the people home, or actually calling for a real declaration of war, whether it's against Iraq or Syria or whoever. If they want to do that, I would oppose those things because I don't think what is moral and right only comes with a passage of a declaration of war. And there are very strong arguments to be made that the founders didn't approve of that kind of thing either. You couldn't actually, it would be illegal to actually support an offensive war even with a declaration, according to many founders. But that, I think, is another episode on its own. But here's what Washington had to say. If you don't like how it is, this is what you do. He says, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. You don't want Congress to have the power to declare war because you think they're evil and they're going to pass off secrets to the enemy? Then work for an amendment to change that and give the power to the executive branch. But just recognize that when you do that, you're also giving it to the Hillary Clintons, the Bernie Sanders of the world, and vice versa. So, but he goes on. He says, let there be no change by usurpation. And usurpation is an exercise of power not delegated to the government. It is a stealing of sovereign power, power of the sovereign people. He says, for though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. I don't know about you guys, but when it comes to following the Constitution, I'm going to stick with George Washington on this one versus anyone alive today. There is no argument that can say, just this one time only, it was an emergency. What are we going to do if Congress do nothing Nancy Pelosi won't allow it to happen? Well, that's a different problem. Don't call for more violations of the Constitution, because even if in one instance, as George Washington put it, it may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And this free government was destroyed a long time ago. That does not mean make it worse. The only response is to follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, and no excuses. This has been a long episode, so I'm going to jump past looking at the live chat for questions. I will jump on a little bit later to check it out. I don't get to respond to everything, but I will read through it, and I will do my best to respond to as many as possible, whether it's on Facebook, YouTube, or elsewhere. Of course, if you do have other questions, you can email us or suggestions for other episodes in the future, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, all spelled out again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I hope you enjoyed this show. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. I hope you found something at least educational or something that challenged your current way of thinking. Because even if you don't agree with me, hopefully you found it interesting enough to think about, to at least pause, and that would be pretty awesome in my book. If you support us, smash that like button, continue leaving comments, and of course, if you really want to do something special, our membership program starts as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I see a lot of people out in the live chat that are current members. I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for you whether you're a member or not, but that really, it helps us do this kind of thing more than anything. Again, thank you for being here. I hope your Monday is off to a good start. We'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.